The land of death, Poveglia Island, the most haunted place in the world. Welcome, curious souls, to a tale that will send shivers down your spine. Today, we venture to a place where the very soil beneath your feet is composed of human ash, where the air still carries the scent of burnt flesh, and where the screams of tortured souls echo through abandoned corridors. This is no fictional horror setting, no Hollywood creation designed to frighten. This is Poveglia Island, perhaps the most haunted place on Earth. The birth of darkness. The small island of Poveglia sits just off the coast of Venice, Italy, a seemingly innocent patch of land surrounded by the lagoon's serene waters. To look at it from a distance, you might mistake it for just another picturesque Italian locale. But appearances can be deceiving, for beneath this island's overgrown surface lies a history so dark, so drenched in suffering, that it has transformed this place into what many believe to be a gateway between our world and whatever lies beyond. Poveglia's story begins innocently enough in 421 AD. This cluster of three connected islands, one covered entirely in vegetation and the other two built up with wooden pillars similar to Venice itself, initially served as a refuge. The smallest of the three islands forms an octagonal shape, once housing a small fort that protected the area and served as a checkpoint before travelers could reach Venice proper. For centuries, life on Poveglia Island remained relatively peaceful. During the 9th century, it became home to refugees from Padua and Este. People lived, loved, and built their lives on this small patch of land, surrounded by the gentle waters of the Venetian lagoon. But like many tales of horror, this period of peace was merely the calm before the storm. In 1379, during what became known as the Chioggia War, Venice came under attack from Genoa. Poveglia's inhabitants were forced to flee to another island called Giudecca, and thus began Poveglia's first abandonment, a prelude to the darkness that would later engulf it. For nearly 400 years, the island remained largely vacant, a forgotten footnote in Venetian history. But in 1776, fate intervened when Poveglia came under the jurisdiction of the local public health office. At this time, the island was transformed into a checkpoint, a form of customs control area where ships would stop for inspection before being permitted to continue to Venice. And it was here in 1793 that Poveglia's dark destiny was sealed forever. Two ships, having stopped at the island for routine checks, were discovered to be harboring a terrible secret. Their passengers and crew were infected with the bubonic plague. The Black Death, that merciless killer that had already decimated Europe's population centuries earlier, had returned, and Poveglia Island was about to become its new kingdom. The Island of Plague. Imagine, if you will, the terror that must have gripped Venice when the Black Death returned to its shores. Venice was itself an island city, vulnerable to the rapid spread of disease. The authorities needed a solution, a place to isolate the infected, to deal with the mounting corpses, somewhere far enough from the city to prevent further contagion, yet close enough to transport the sick and the dead. Poveglia Island was the answer. Soon, a grim procession began. Ships laden with the dead and dying made their way across the lagoon to Poveglia. Those already consumed by the plague were unceremoniously dumped into massive pits, death pits, as they came to be known. The dying were left on the shores or in makeshift plague wards, abandoned to suffer their final agonizing hours without comfort or care. As the plague continued its relentless march through Venice, the death pits of Poveglia filled at an alarming rate. When they could hold no more, they were set ablaze or covered with earth, only for new pits to be dug nearby. The smoke from these funeral pyres would have been visible from Venice itself, a constant, terrifying reminder of mortality. The numbers are staggering. While exact figures vary depending on the source, it's believed that between 100,000 and 160,000 plague victims ended their days on Poveglia's shores. Think about that for a moment. Up to 160,000 human beings, each with their own hopes, dreams, and fears, all meeting their end in this small patch of land, their bodies burned or buried in mass graves. It's little wonder, then, that modern estimates suggest approximately 50% of Poveglia's soil is composed of human ash. Even today, visitors report that the island carries a distinctive odor, the lingering scent of burnt human remains that over 2 centuries have failed to completely dissipate. For those brought to Poveglia still clinging to life, the experience must have been a waking nightmare. Imagine knowing that you've been transported to what amounts to an open-air morgue, surrounded by the dead and dying, with no hope of treatment or recovery. The lucky ones would have succumbed quickly. Others would have lingered for days, their cries for help going unanswered as the plague slowly claimed them. And through it all, the island absorbed their suffering, their pain, their despair, their final desperate pleas, like a sponge soaking up spilled blood. If places can indeed retain the emotional energy of events that transpire within them, then Poveglia would have been saturated with the negative energies of thousands of tragic deaths. But the island's dark chapter as a plague colony would eventually come to an end. The Black Death receded, and for a time, Poveglia was once again abandoned. But its days as a site of human suffering were far from over. The Asylum of Horrors. As the 20th century dawned, the buildings on Poveglia Island, structures that had witnessed so much death and despair, were repurposed. They would no longer house plague victims, but would instead serve as a psychiatric hospital. In an age when mental illness was poorly understood and often feared, psychiatric institutions were frequently places of neglect and abuse rather than healing. Poveglia's remote location and dark history made it particularly suited to hiding away those society wished to forget. Patients were brought to the island, far from the eyes of the public, where they could be treated, or mistreated, without scrutiny. According to local legends, one doctor in particular stands out in Poveglia's asylum history. A man whose name has been lost to time, but whose deeds have become the stuff of nightmares. This doctor, it's said, saw the isolation of Poveglia as an opportunity. Far from oversight, he was free to conduct whatever treatments he wished on his unfortunate patients. And what he wished for was to perform lobotomies, brutal surgical procedures that involved driving sharp instruments into the brain through the eye socket or the side of the skull. Today, we understand lobotomies to be barbaric procedures that rarely improved patients' conditions and often left them in vegetative states. But this doctor was convinced they could cure mental illness. Reports suggest he performed these violent procedures on numerous unwilling patients, their screams echoing across the abandoned island with no one to hear their pleas for mercy. The bell tower of the asylum reportedly held special significance for this sadistic physician. It was here that he took his favorite patients, though what exactly transpired in that tower remains unclear. Some accounts suggest it was where he performed his most experimental procedures, others that it was where he tortured those who defied him. Whatever the truth, the bell tower became synonymous with suffering and fear. But as often happens in tales of horror, evil eventually met its match. According to the most widespread version of the legend, the doctor's cruelty finally triggered his own descent into madness. Perhaps it was guilt that drove him to insanity, or perhaps it was something more supernatural, the spirits of his victims, or the plague dead seeking vengeance. In the 1930s, the doctor's reign of terror came to an abrupt end when he climbed to the top of the bell tower, the very site of so much suffering he had inflicted, and threw himself to the ground below. But even this account has variations that add to the island's mystique. Some say he didn't jump, but was pushed by his patients who had finally had enough of his cruelty. Others tell an even more chilling tale, that the fall itself didn't kill him, but that a mysterious fog rose from the ground, enveloped him, and choked the life from his body before receding back into the earth. Whether this was the island itself exacting revenge, or the collective power of the spirits trapped there, no one can say. But with the doctor's death, the asylum's days were numbered. Eventually, it too was abandoned, leaving the buildings to slowly crumble and decay. Perfect habitats for the restless spirits said to roam there. The haunting. With such a history of suffering and death, it's little wonder that Poveglia Island has gained a reputation as one of the most haunted locations on Earth. The paranormal claims associated with this small patch of land are as numerous as they are chilling. Local fishermen who have plied the waters around Poveglia for generations refuse to go near the island to this day. Their reluctance stems not just from superstition, but from disturbing experiences. Over time, erosion has exposed some of the mass graves on the island, and fishermen have reported catching human bones in their nets. Grim reminders of the island's history that periodically make their way to the surface. But it's not just physical remains that trouble these mariners. Many claim to hear screams coming from the island, the agonized cries of asylum patients echoing across the water despite the facility having been closed for decades. Even more unsettling, some report hearing the ringing of the asylum's bell tower, though the bell itself was removed long ago. Some say this phantom bell is rung by the spirit of the doctor who once tormented patients there. According to local lore, his ghost remains trapped on the island, tormented in death as he tormented others in life. The spirits of plague victims, it said, hound him relentlessly, driving him to repeat his fatal leap from the tower night after night for all eternity. But the doctor is far from the only spirit said to haunt Poveglia. Among the most frequently reported apparitions is that of a young girl known simply as Little Maria. Believed to be a plague victim, this child spirit has been seen wandering the overgrown beaches of the island, her sorrowful wailing carrying across the water on still nights. Those brave, or foolish, enough to visit Poveglia often report overwhelming sensations upon setting foot on its shores. Many describe feeling as though they're being watched or followed as they explore the island. Others experience sudden, inexplicable emotional responses, waves of dread, sorrow, or despair that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The abandoned asylum buildings themselves present their own horrors. To enter the main hospital structure, visitors must pass through what was once one of the cremation machines used to dispose of plague victims, a macabre entrance that sets the tone for what lies beyond. Inside, shadows are said to streak across walls of their own accord. A young female spirit, perhaps a former patient, has been glimpsed in various parts of the building, apparently still terrified of the doctor who once experimented on her and others like her. Some visitors have reported being scratched or pushed by unseen forces. Others have captured orbs or strange mists in photographs, anomalies that skeptics might dismiss as dust or lens flare, but which bear an unsettling resemblance to the mysterious fog said to have claimed the doctor's life. Electronic equipment is said to malfunction with unusual frequency on the island. Batteries drain inexplicably. Recordings are marred by strange static or contain voices and sounds that weren't audible at the time they were made. All of these phenomena point to Poveglia being what paranormal researchers call a thin place, a location where the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond has been worn thin by the sheer magnitude of suffering that took place there. Poveglia today. Poveglia Island. Today stands abandoned, a crumbling monument to suffering that few are permitted to visit. Officially owned by the Italian state, access to the island requires special permission, typically granted only for research, photography projects, or filming purposes. Time has not been kind to the structures that once housed plague victims and psychiatric patients. Many have completely collapsed, while those still standing are dangerously unstable. Vegetation has reclaimed much of the island, creeping over ruins and through broken windows, as if nature itself is trying to erase the evidence of human suffering that took place there. Yet, despite the dangers, both physical and perhaps supernatural, the island continues to attract thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, and those drawn to dark tourism. They come in small boats, usually under cover of darkness, risking fines and their own safety for a chance to experience one of the world's most haunted locations firsthand. What they find is a place frozen in time, medical equipment still littering some rooms of the asylum, beds where patients once lay restrained now covered in dust and debris, windows broken by weather or vandals providing the only light in corridors where the doctor once walked. In one particularly poignant corner of the island, partially buried and strangled by vegetation, lies a stone marker. Its inscription, Nephodius, translates to "do not dig" or "do not disturb." Below these words is a simple statement: "The dead rest here from contagion, 1793. It stands as perhaps the only formal acknowledgement of the thousands who perished on Poveglia's shores, a warning to leave undisturbed those who already suffered so greatly in life. But are they truly at rest? The paranormal activity reported on the island suggests otherwise. Perhaps the souls of Poveglia are trapped there, unable to move on due to the traumatic nature of their deaths. Or perhaps the island itself has somehow absorbed the negative energy of so much suffering, replaying it like a cosmic recording for those sensitive enough to perceive it. Whatever the truth may be, Poveglia Island stands as a dark chapter in human history, a place where the veil between life and death, past and present, seems particularly thin. In a world increasingly dominated by technology and science, it reminds us that there are still mysteries we cannot easily explain, forces we cannot readily dismiss. For those of us who study the paranormal, places like Poveglia offer compelling evidence that sometimes, when conditions are right, or perhaps when they're terribly wrong, the dead may indeed continue to make their presence known among the living. The eternal haunting. As our journey through the dark history of Poveglia comes to an end, I invite you to consider this. What makes a place haunted? Is it simply the accumulation of tragic events, or is there something more profound at work? Poveglia Island has witnessed more than its share of suffering. Up to 160,000 plague victims drawing their final breaths on its shores. Countless psychiatric patients subjected to torturous treatments in the name of medicine, a doctor driven to suicide or murdered, depending on which version of the tale you believe. If any place deserves the title of most haunted, surely this small island in the Venetian lagoon has earned it. The human ash that makes up half its soil, the phantom screams that carry across the water, the ghostly bell that continues to toll long after its physical counterpart was removed. The apparitions of little Maria and others seen wandering its overgrown paths. Together, they paint a picture of a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where tragedy has left an indelible mark not just on human memory, but perhaps on reality itself. Today, Poveglia stands abandoned, its buildings gradually crumbling back into the earth. Perhaps one day, when the last wall has fallen and nature has completely reclaimed the island, the souls trapped there will finally find peace. Or perhaps they will continue their eternal haunting, serving as a grim reminder of a past we should never forget. For now, the island remains a forbidden place, a dark legend, a testament to human suffering, and just possibly the most haunted spot on Earth. If you visit Venice, you might catch a glimpse of Poveglia from the water, that small, unassuming island with its crumbling bell tower